I'm Dr. Alex Safian, Associate Director and Research Director of CAMERA. It's always a high point of CAMERA's trips to Israel to hear Eran Lerman's lucid and brilliant assessments of the key issues facing Israel, whether it's the key issues of the day or the likely key issues of the future. Though we all wish it was under happier circumstances, in today's perilous and uncertain times, it is even more important to be hearing from Eran. Eran is a reserve colonel in the IDF. He was Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, and he held senior positions in the IDF military intelligence for over 20 years. He also served for 8 years as Director of the Israel and Middle East Office of the American Jewish Committee. He teaches in the Middle East Studies program at Shalem College in Jerusalem and in postgraduate programs at Tel Aviv University and the National Defense College. Eran is a third-generation Sabra. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and a mid-career MPA from Harvard University, and is Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Welcome, Eran.
Thank you, Alex. It's good to be among friends, which offers some solace in this terrible time, and it is a terrible time in Israel. The stories of the butchery, of the murder, of the bloodthirsty attack on us on the 7th of October keep coming in. So do the stories of unbelievable heroism, both by soldiers who rushed to the scene and actually eliminated, by and large, this invasion within 36 hours. But also of the civilians who either fought or just survived or ultimately perished in this unspeakable horror, which, as President Biden has said, and most all Israelis feel, has evoked the memories of our darkest hours. And let me start by saying that there's no question there has been a major failure of assessments at the intelligence level, at the both strategic and operational, at the level of operational deployment. Our ground forces have become far too thin over the last decades, and things will have to change dramatically once this is over. And there's also no question that Hamas have been able to score a brilliant, in their own terms, a brilliant tactical and operational success in the first day. So did the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, although that was a military operation, not a butchery. But in much the same way as the full strategic consequences for Japan, for Nazi Germany, of their early brilliance was ultimate catastrophe, so will it be for Hamas, because there is a determination in Israel and almost entirely across the board. There are some dissenting voices who either worry about the nature of the ground campaign or basically do not see us actually crushing Hamas. But the great majority across the board, including people on the traditional left as well as and the center and right of the Israeli spectrum, are all committed to the strategy of this government, which is to bring Hamas down, to put an end to its rule in Gaza. We cannot expect the good people who survived the onslaught on their villages, on their kibbutzim, on their towns, to go back and live normally next to this poisonous snake. And as one of our ministers told me in a private conversation, a poisonous snake is a compliment compared to what we saw on October 7th. So this is what is at stake. The question is, of course, how do we do it? How do we minimize our casualties? How do we do it effectively, thoroughly, Given that Hamas is now trapped, there is no way out. We have the forces not only to destroy them, deployed. We have a resilient society and a resilient economy that can sustain a relatively prolonged campaign. These are not the fragile days of the 50s and 60s, when a mobilization of 300,000 put us at a situation where we had to strike fast and hard. We can sustain this for some time if necessary and act judiciously and effectively. What is emerging as of now is a division between the northern and southern parts of the Gaza Strip, which would be dealt with under different timetables. And since it is in the northern part, which includes Gaza City, where Hamas has its so-called metro of underground tunnels where they are all holed up, it is there that the main battle will be fought. And afterwards, things will need to shift, and mopping up operations and destruction operations will move south, while the population can perhaps gradually and under strict control can be allowed to come back. Meanwhile, and this has been very much at the center, not only of our concerns, but also of American responses, essentially from day one, and that's a remarkable situation, I have to say, regardless of what your political sentiments are or have been, either here or stateside, there is a sense in Israel now of appreciation and respect for the position taken by President Biden right from the very beginning. This is the first time we've had a visit of an American president to Israel at wartime. By the way, also the visits of the German Chancellor and the Prime Minister of Great Britain. These are not trivial matters. This has never happened before at wartime, not in 73, not in 82, certainly not in 67. And so the main question that now hangs over the future of this war is whether or not Iran would push Hezbollah into a full-scale confrontation. A limited confrontation is already going on the northern front. There have been casualties, there have been limited, but some casualties. There have been Israeli counterstrikes, artillery, and Air Force. There have been rockets fired at Kiryat Shmona today, relatively larger salvo than in previous days, still attributed to Hamas in Lebanon, not to Hezbollah, but they stand poised to intervene. And the speculation, of course, that the trigger for their intervention may be the Israeli ground incursion in Gaza, which is bound to come sooner or later, maybe sooner. However, I should also say that there are three factors, the way we see it, perhaps even I would add a fourth, namely the fragility and fears of Lebanese society that would suffer the brunt of what would happen to Lebanon if Hezbollah goes in, and maybe they're doing their best now to keep Hezbollah down and prevent this from deteriorating further. But beyond that, there are three other factors that I should mention. One is that the IDF is now in full deployment in the north. The 350 or 60,000 Israelis who were called up for reserve service, it's the fullest reserve service since in 50 years. By the way, the percentage of reporting to duty is well above 100%. That is to say, people keep showing up who are not called, and insisting that they should be allowed to join the fight. Sometimes it even creates logistical problems because there are more men than equipment at the mobilization points. But overall, this is massive enough to provide both for the southern front. We don't need to push 360,000 people into the Gaza Strip. There's a roughly equal or perhaps larger deployment of maneuvering formations at ready in the north. So there's certainly not going to be any element of surprise playing for Hezbollah up there, the kind of thing that happened, that Hamas enjoyed tragically and unfortunately on October 7th. So that's the first point. And they know a thing or two about the capabilities of Israel. For 17 years, we more or less saw very little by way of military action from Hezbollah. We were careful not to provoke them, but they were very careful not to provoke us, having learned some lessons in 2006. You may remember that at the time, Hassan Nasrallah said, had I known what the Israeli response would turn out to be, I wouldn't have done it. And so this is one key element that still serves as a restraining factor. But since we are in an unprecedented situation with bloodthirsty urges being pushed from those elements in the Arab world which see themselves aligned with the resistance, the muqawama, the danger of Hezbollah and intervention backed by Iran was evident from day one, which led to an American commitment, which is also unprecedented. This is not just the language of the president and, this don't, but there's also the deployment to the Eastern Mediterranean of two carrier task forces, the Gerald R. Ford and the Eisenhower. The Ford is the most modern carrier in the American fleet, and was carrying very significant firepower. And that's not a trivial matter. And side by side with the moral outrage that drove President Biden's decisions and the administration's decisions, there's also the very rapid American response, both in terms of deployment and in terms of opening the supply line to Israel basically within a day. They are also the result of the fact that Israel for the last couple of years has been part of CENTCOM, and Central Command has been very closely coordinated with the Israeli military. General Kurilla has been here many times since he took command. He came here again this week, and very quickly the all bureaucratic barriers were removed, and the United States moved in as an ally should, and demonstrating, by the way, as my friend Bob Silverman says, that anyone who assumed that the U.S. is a finished, spent force in world affairs, perhaps should still think twice. So while the Iranians are making all kinds of ugly noises, threatening Americans across the region, they are also, I think, they don't trivialize the consequences of a confrontation with the United States. And the third element, of course, is all these years, Hezbollah in Lebanon was kept as in reserve against the day that Iran may need to deter us from attacking or punish us for attacking the nuclear infrastructure. And to waste this asset to save Hamas may not be the wisest thing to do from an Iranian point of view. So all of this goes into the mix. And of course, there are people in Israel who are actually advocating going after Hezbollah, even as we fight Hamas. Well, the answer to this probably comes from Clausewitz. Concentrate your effort, concentrate your firepower, get one thing done at a time, unless, of course, they leave us no choice by going all out against Israel, in which case, of course, the full power of the IDF and the Air Force will be unleashed on Lebanon, possibly with some American backing as necessary, maybe not necessary, but as necessary. So all of this is right now at the top of the decision makers' concerns in Israel, how to avoid a northern deterioration at this point in time while concentrating on the destruction of Hamas, slowly, gradually grinding them to fine dust in Gaza. Another concern, of course, is that there is pressure on Israel to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe, which we have no wish for. This is why we are asking the population of Gaza City to relocate to the south. But this generates another dilemma for Israel, namely, can we, on one hand, respond to these expectations, and at the same time try to force the hand of Hamas on the release of our hostages, 199 or perhaps 202 confirmed hostages in the hands of Hamas, 30 of them children, more than a dozen of them elderly, young men and women taken from the rave near Kibbutz Re'im, others soldiers captured in the border posts. It is a terrible dilemma. But at the end of the day, unless, of course, we're going to surrender to Hamas demands, which is unthinkable under the circumstances, the likelihood that any gesture short of cutting off our military effort would persuade Hamas to let go of this card. It's a terrible term for human beings, but that they are holding, it's not very likely. Let's say that we would have made the humanitarian relief conditional upon their release. Hamas would have celebrated the horrors of humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and used it, as we saw in this fake hospital business, to manipulate the international community against us. So we are walking a very complicated, thin line. We have agreed to let the Egyptians do something in the south in terms of humanitarian supply, but this will not prevent us and will not hamper us in going after the Hamas where they are under the ground. We have the capacity and the technologies where necessary to do this. This is something that the IDF has been taking into account for some time now. The third question, which is only now beginning to emerge, has to do with the day after. And here, frankly, I admit, and I'm saying this as somebody who served for 6 years as Deputy National Security Advisor, and I don't think we ever settled down to plan in detail the scenario of a reconquest of Gaza and what this might entail in terms of administrative solutions for the transitional period and who should take over if and when we leave. And I believe that while some Israelis want to see us now permanently in Gaza, the government and the majority of Israelis would like to see some kind of what's referred to in American military terms as an exit strategy. But this is not going, let me say what's not going to happen. We are not going to hand this over to an 88-year-old doddering anti-Semite who can hardly rule Ramallah, let alone manage the immense task of reconstructing Gaza after the war. The Palestinian Authority is simply not a proposition. Anyone in Washington or anywhere else, in Israel or in Europe or wherever, who entertains such expectations must have a very vague sense of how governance or the lack of it actually what it looks like in the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas and his voracious family and cronies. This is not a capacity. And in the same breath, I'd say also the UN, we all know what UN institutions look like, who dominates them, and how horrific the record has been, for example, of UNRWA operating in Gaza from an Israeli perspective. We did not want to see it completely defunded because we never had an interest in a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. But we also know what was taught in their schools and what the actual physical infrastructure of these schools was used for. So the UN is not a proposition either. We have to start thinking creatively about our role, the role of Egypt, the role of reliable, like-minded elements in the international community. Even as I mentioned, I worked very closely at the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune with Robert Silverman, former American diplomat, now a proud Israeli. And he wrote just now an essay suggesting that we learn things. I mean, this is not a copy-paste proposition, but learn things from the successful model of the MFO in Sinai, the multinational force and observers, which is run not by the UN, because the Soviets blocked that back in '79, but it's run by the United States, Israel, and Egypt. And so we might start thinking about such solutions down the road. But right now, all energies and all attention at the level of Israeli leadership, as distinct from, planning professionals who should start getting the drafts written. The focal point for the Israeli leadership is to break Hamas, and as we do it, see what can be humanly done to bring the kidnapped hostages back, not at the cost of a surrender to Hamas demands. And it is against this context, also in this context, we should assess the American position and the American support. It does raise certain questions. For many years, we had this mantra that we would defend ourselves by ourselves. It remains valid, make no mistake about it. Secretary Blinken, during his visit here, said, you may be able, well, I think he meant to say, you are able to do, it's a question how you play with the English language, but I think you may be able can be translated as, I know you are able to defend yourself by yourself, but you don't need to, because we are here to help you deter Hezbollah and Iran. If that fails, the brunt of the response will fall on us. It may be of help to have an ally with us, given the magnitude of what we are facing. At the end of the day, what has been happening since October 7 validates the Israeli-American special relationship in all its aspects. In the moral I often use the shorthand VIP, values, interests, and politics. The shock to the American value system was so severe that even Ilhan Omar said something. Of course, she retracted soon after. But the understanding of the enormity of what happened, and we don't need in here among us, we don't need to go into the graphic detail of what we all know has happened. The moral and shock to American values definitely plays a part in this bipartisan support, which was made manifest both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. We have a senatorial mission here, and so on. The other thing is interest. This is in the interest of America. It's in the interest of the West. It is, despite their cowardly behavior, in the interest of most or all of the moderate Arab regimes, that this organization and what it stands for, and their friends and backers in Iran and in Lebanon should suffer a clear and unquestionable defeat. First by the destruction of Hamas, and then with a different equation in Lebanon as well. So that's at the level of interest. The level of politics, of course, it is good politics in America to stand with Israel. It worries us that this is catching you in America at a time of serious political disarray, which doesn't help. Frankly, we look from a distance amidst our own troubles at the difficulty of putting your congressional house in order. And we actually need it to be in order, because sooner or later we will have to rely on a significant supplemental budgetary support. What else can I say? The masks are off. We see Putin's position. We see very ugly and unprecedented anti-Semitic undertones creep into the Chinese discourse. And there's an alarm here in Israel. I can, it's one of the places where my children live, because that's when I get indications. It's not here in Modi'in, but it is in Holon, where my daughter lives. So she's taking shelter now. Forgive me, because that was I silenced my cell phone, but this one breaks through every time it happens. So in the broader sense, this conflict also ties in with the larger scheme of things that is increasingly dividing the world between forces of darkness and those who support them, and what once upon a time people used to call with pride the free world. That's what we stand for. That's what we defend with our bodies, with the lives of our soldiers. The olive line of defense of our soldiers down south is the line of defense of civilization. And I'm saying civilization generally, not Western civilization, because there are many Muslims I know, including some who I know very well. Ahmed Sharai, my Moroccan publisher, came out on the first day with an essay under the title, "We Are All Israelis," and he faces a serious backlash from the radical bastards in his own country. But we stand for civilization and for hope. And we're going to win, although this is going to be a bitter fight. And the lessons of what happened to us on the 7th of October will have to be learned and reflected upon, and possibly people will have to ultimately account for this failure all the way up to the political echelon. But all of this would have to wait until the war is over. At this point, if we can open this to questions, I see. Shall I read them, or will you, Alex? Will you
No,
take?
I'll read them because we're not going to ask all of them, but thank you. Well, thank you very much, Eran, for your, as usual, cogent and incisive briefing. There are a lot of questions. One that I wanted to ask you is about Hamas had great operational security in this. There was no information that was leaked. You have a lot of, or some agents within Gaza. Is there fear now that they were double agents and that they fed you disinformation?
Well, I think that the entire intelligence and failure and its details and what drove it at both, as I said, at both the strategic level, in which we bought into the domestication theory of Hamas. Many serious people I know. To some extent, I would say I was also reading what the IDF was and the intelligence and the security establishment was saying, and it seemed plausible at the time. They set out 2 rounds of fighting with Palestinian Islamic Jihad in 2022 and 23. Operations, what we called operations Breaking Dawn, and then Shield and Arrow. But that all of this seemed to confirm that Hamas is actually negotiating for a larger piece of a pie, rather than preparing for what we now know they were doing. But the full extent of what drove this failure, both in terms of the Shin Bet, which has the HUMINT portfolio in Gaza, and the DMI, which ultimately handles the other collection means and the analysis, all of this would have, I wouldn't prejudge the specifics until a full process has been launched. And of course, it doesn't stop there. It will go all the way up to the strategic decision to not only tolerate Hamas, but help the Qataris feed them. And I should have mentioned in my when I spoke that this is also time to end Qatar's privileges in Washington, to host the murderers and be defined as an American major non-NATO ally. That doesn't compute. And so unless they come clean in the fullest sense, this is no longer tolerable.
One thing that comes to mind regarding the domestication of Hamas, and they're supposedly becoming more or less responsible governors concerned about the population, to the extent that Iran has a lot of influence over them, and I think Iran does. I always remember what happened in the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, when some of the westernized aides that still existed to Khomeini told him that the people were very unhappy because of inflation, the price of food. And he famously said, "We did not have an Islamic revolution to lower the price of melons." I think that's something that maybe should have been kept in mind, that is not why Hamas exists, to be good governors or to take care of the population. Now, a further question is, there's a very serious internal situation in Egypt. Like, the economy perhaps has never been worse. Just last week, major Egyptian banks banned the use of Egyptian debit cards abroad because of the terrible lack of foreign reserves. So this,
yeah, we warned against this in our magazine the other day. Yes.
So
Egypt is a powerless state.
So
we could leverage this. But I don't believe, frankly, I know that there are many Israelis who would love to see the Gazans move to Sinai. That's not going to happen. The Egyptians have a very keen sense of why they have no wish for this to happen. But we could leverage Egyptian needs so that they play a constructive role in the plans for the day after, in ensuring, which is also in their own interest, because being threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood, that Hamas never raises its head again in Gaza.
But do you think they might go further? I could envision a situation where, with support of the Arab League, Egypt is brought in as the temporary guardian to rebuild to rebuild Gaza and to make a lot of money, and a lot of money from Saudi Arabia and the United States and Egyptian construction companies putting Gazans to work to clear the rubble, to rebuild, etc. They make money like they used to with smuggling before 67, where they made a lot of money in Gaza, the military did. Could you see something like that, where a temporary, which may be forever, where the flow is Egypt into Gaza, not Gazans into Egypt?
Well, quite frankly, I would like to see anything of that sort happening under very, very tight controls, because, and is it in Israel's interest for whatever, the equivalent of 2 Egyptian divisions to be parked within a short drive from Ashkelon? It's better than Hamas, as it turns out, and we were wrong to think otherwise. I will frankly say I was wrong to think otherwise. I used to say that Hamas is the lesser of the 2 dangers, because it is much less effective as a fighting force. I did not imagine in my worst dreams the extent of such a success in breaching our defenses. But at the end of the day, of course, it took us 36 hours to finish off the invaders. An Egyptian division may be a different story. So we have to be very, very careful on how we handle intelligently an Egyptian role in the context of perhaps a broader mandate. And at the end of the day, we shall need to look also for a Palestinian local leadership that will finally internalize the catastrophe that the Nazi past has brought upon them. This is playing with words, but a kind of Gazan Adenauer. Some people, young people who would understand that what happened to them, to the place they live in, was the result of a Nazi fantasy that dragged them into the abyss.
It's also important to stress, as I think Shimon Peres said, that Gaza could have been Singapore. Gaza could have been Hong Kong had they chosen.
Well, yes, but that would require resettling it with Singaporeans.
Well, yes, I mean, that's the thought experiment I like to say. If you transfer populations, within 3 days, there'd be business deals and hotels reopening and tourism, etc. But, they had the option. They could have turned it into Hong Kong, and there would have been no checkpoints and minimal border controls, etc. They chose otherwise. Going again to the situation with Jordan and Egypt, what about the internal situation in light of what has happened and in light of what may happen militarily in Gaza? Where do you see the internal situation going in Jordan, Egypt, and other Arab countries?
Well, so far they've withstood the stress test. And if actually the realization that we were right about the hospital business and Hamas was basically lying through their teeth about it, does seep in, and that's a challenge for all who may have access to the international media and also to the Arab media, to see if that kind of realization can break through the barriers of denial. It may have dampened the outburst of hate. Although, as we saw in places, for example, in Tunisia, there was a synagogue attacked and destroyed, and we saw demonstrations, massive demonstrations in Amman and so on. There is a serious reason for concern, but the regime so far seemed to be able to handle it. And much depends on how we handle the combat going forward, but ultimately the destruction of Hamas would come as a relief for the Egyptians, for the Jordanians, for the Saudis, for the Emiratis, who know full well what this means for them.
The slaughter in Israel, mostly of civilians, what impact did this have in the Arab world? And I ask that in context that Ruth Weiss once said that bringing Arabs to the Holocaust Museum was only encouraging them to say, oh, well, the Jews aren't that tough. You can slaughter them in huge numbers. What is that slaughter? I mean, obviously there are some people in the Arab world who will be repulsed by it, but on the other hand, is it encouraging to other people in the Arab world?
Well, we are working on discouraging them. It's to say the full consequences of this folly. I mean, this was brilliant operationally, as I said, and morally and strategically catastrophic. And we are working on both fronts. You know, the fact that Khaled Mashal, that smarmy bastard holed up in a nice hotel in Qatar, felt obliged to start, and Ahouri as well, were obliged to explain that they were not the murderers. It was other Gazans who came in and did all these terrible things, which, by the way, is not entirely, they did play a role in some of the worst atrocities. But that's not, that doesn't exonerate Hamas from the full responsibility of everything that happened. And the fact that they started, you know, trying to shed off the blame means that they understand that they're facing a catastrophe in terms of their image, even in the Arab world, in some parts of the Arab world. But yes, there are many people in the streets of Western capitals who celebrate this butchery. And I'm glad that the British government and the German government have made it clear that support for such acts is an illegal act. In America, it's more difficult because freedom of speech takes Americans to bizarre extremes. But still, you see this in many places. And ultimately, our only way to dissuade such people is to make it very clear that the cost is huge.
We see that also on American campuses. The stuff coming from Students for Justice in Palestine is simply bloodthirsty. It's quite amazing. Under what circumstances do you think the U.S. would intervene, and how would it intervene?
It's a tough question. I think that if we face a major onslaught by Hezbollah with their tens or thousands, upwards of 100,000 rockets on Israel while we still fight in Gaza, on Iranian orders, I would not rule out American support. The task forces have Aegis systems and of course air-to-ground capabilities. I would not rule that out under the circumstances. We are not going to ask for American boots on the ground, but American firepower under certain circumstances could be brought in to support our own effort.
Now, regarding the Abraham Accords and the Saudi reaction, do you view this as very damaging to the Abraham Accords and the Saudi reaction? And of course, the question also is the Abraham Accords were based in part on the view of Israel as a reliable and powerful partner. And unfortunately, the events of October 7th call that into question. So what is the overall impact on the Abraham Accords?
Well, that's too early to say. It very much depends on the outcome of the overall campaign. So far, there's been no breach from Bahrain, UAE, or Morocco. MBZ actually spoke with Netanyahu. But public opinion, of course, is stirred up there, and pressures. The UAE went to the United Nations to call for a ceasefire. Covering their softer parts under the circumstances is almost understandable. But the prospect of the survival of the Abraham Accords and the revival of the normalization effort with Saudi Arabia very much depend on Israel winning this war.
What do you think are the reasons for the IDF delay? I'm sure there are many reasons, overlapping reasons, but how would you list them to go in, I mean, on the ground?
On the ground, there were several considerations. We needed to, first of all, consolidate our position in the north, so we are not caught off guard there as well. Many of our reserve units need better training and cohesion. Plans have to be reformulated constantly because of the shifting intelligence situation. And to some extent, we needed to let as many Palestinians migrate south before we go in, because nobody wants to see too many uninvolved getting crushed in the onslaught. And to some extent also there was, I would say, a degree of natural caution. Hamas surprised us once. We don't want to be surprised again. We need to be much more confident and solid about the intelligence we have on the ground and about the level of erosion and destruction that we can inflict. You may remember that the most formidable military coalition ever in 1991 took four long weeks of aerial operations before it felt confident and safe enough to go in and finish the Iraqi military in the Kuwait War, the Gulf, the first Gulf War, or the second Gulf War, whatever you wish to call it, under Bush 41. So we need not rush too much, because Hamas would be there under the ground, holed up and unable to do much in a few days as well. But we can also not wait too long for internal more reasons, morale and expectations of the Israeli public for this to be done with. But also, of course, we cannot keep our reserves mobilized interminably.
U.S. support is very nice, but some people have termed it a bear hug, which means it's a two-way street. It sort of has multiple effects. Yes, there's a great deal of support now, but that support can then be leveraged to restrain Israel in a what could be a damaging way for Israeli interests. Could you comment on that, how Israel can handle that, if you think that's true, and how it can handle it?
It does constrain what some of our options in the day after. Frankly, if there are people in Israel, and I'm going to be very blunt here, the people in Israel are entertaining visions of resettling Gush Katif or pushing the Gazans out and building Israeli communities there. That's not going to happen, frankly. I mean, it's an understandable act of retribution, but this is not about retribution. This is about reestablishing security in the deepest sense. And here, the dialogue with America about the day after may constrain us in some respects, but I think there will be our voice will be very clearly heard, but the administration will also have a certain say. I think in terms of operational constraints, I have seen nothing until now to indicate that the Americans are actually holding us back beyond the specific question of a humanitarian corridor for the Gazan population in the south.
Israel had a much criticized policy in Gaza with regard to Hamas, which people have termed quiet for quiet, where if they did not attack Israel, then Israel did not attack them, which is very different from the policy in the West Bank, where Israeli troops were operating every night in order to keep Hamas from gaining power and to keep Abbas in power, but also to break up terrorist infrastructure.
Right.
I guess quiet for quiet.
Propositions, of course.
Sorry, go ahead. Repeat.
These are very different propositions. The IDF can do this based on pinpoint intelligence in the West Bank, day in, day out. There have been major operations going on, by the way, while we confront Hamas in Gaza. Hundreds and hundreds of operatives were picked up in the West Bank. There have been clashes. I think there were more than 60 Palestinians actually killed in clashes. There have been some serious incidents today. Some of our men were wounded in Tulkarm. But basically, this is a very different kind of action, intelligence and action cycle than the one involving the situation in Gaza, where you have to go in and destroy. If you want to basically disable Hamas capabilities, you have to go in and fight and destroy them. And this is something that the IDF avoided doing for these 17 years. With limited, of course, incursions in 2008 and 2014, for one major reason, not because they didn't think they could win or because they were afraid of casualties, but because they did not want to control Gaza, because the questions hanging over the day after are very formidable, and they will be formidable now. But this argument has ended. This is no longer the question. The question is not whether, but how.
Well, thank you very much, Eran. I know you have to leave before the hour, so I want to thank you again for your...
I'm sure I answered only part of the question, so maybe if you want to find a way to communicate and try to answer them in other ways. And of course, maybe we need to reschedule at some point next week when we would have some answers to some of the questions.
Oh, well, we'll definitely do that. Thank you very much for the offer, Eran, and thank you again for joining us and answering so many questions and clarifying so many things. Before we go, I just want to say that we appreciate the support of everyone in the audience and all of the camera members and supporters. We're operating on many different levels. We're operating in the Arab media, we're operating on campus, we're operating in the Spanish media, we're operating in the British media. And of course, there's a flood of problems in all those arenas. And so we appreciate your support, and we asked for folks to support us as much as possible in this hour of need, and also to get your friends and colleagues who are not supporters of camera to join you. If you hear from people, your friends, your colleagues who are very upset about what's going on, well, they can help do something about it. They can support camera in our efforts to get the media coverage and what's going on campus and what's going on in British media and Arab media straightened out, and to fight back against this onslaught against Israel. So I thank you again for joining us, and please consider what support you can give to Israel by supporting camera. So thanks again, and goodbye for now.